Good afternoon, I should say. This is the beginning of week 5 of our course, and we're going to be going over adolescence, which is everyone's favorite time of life. Some of you may be living with an adolescent and you can't stand it. Others of you may really enjoy living with adolescents and enjoy working with adolescents. It takes a special person because there's so much going on physically, hormonally, in the young age of an adolescent that affects their mood, their behavior, um, their personality. It's just a big transition in life. So we're going to kind of go over those things today. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call or to email me. Okay, so adolescence. Adolescence is a transitional time. As we know, it is in between childhood and adulthood. And there's just a ton of growth that happens. And when we're going to look at the brain here in a minute, but especially when we look at the brain, we can see how much change is occurring inside an individual, and that might help us have more grace maybe for the little adolescents that we know. There are two major growth spurts in the teenage years. It's 13 to 15, and it's parts of the brain that control spatial perceptions and motor functioning, and the cerebral cortex becomes thicker, and neuronal pathways become more efficient and more energy is produced. And we notice sometimes between those ages there can be a lot of exhaustion, and just because of all the growing and things like that are happening. 15 years plus, changes in prefrontal cortex are responsible for executive processing. So all of that stuff is developing, and when you think about some of the capacities of children younger than that, a lot happens between that time frame as the brain is developing and growing. And sometimes I think as parents we don't take some of those things into consideration. Okay, so here's the prefrontal cortex. It matures rapidly during adolescence and contributes to advances in executive processing. So this part of the brain is maturing. And to think, when people say you're immature, it's because you really are immature, right? There's part of the brain that literally has not fully developed yet when they're a certain age. The second adolescent brain growth spurt begins around age 17, which is crazy, and continues into early adulthood. The frontal lobes and the cerebral cortex are the focus of development. So here's the frontal lobe. And this is growing during that time. And to think that, I think most of us may have had the preconceived notion that those things have already been grown. But based on research and science, they say that all that is developing during this time frame. So the skeletal system, we have growth patterns, gender differences, and joint development. Puberty, we all know what puberty is. We've hopefully all gone through it. It changes needed for reproductive maturity, right? So the endocrine glands and pituitary glands start working and giving off hormones. Pituitary gland signals adrenal gland, then the androgen is produced. Pituitary hormones stimulate growth of ovaries or testes. Testosterone and estradiol produced, and other growth hormones are produced. So it's like a gigantic circle that's happening here. It's like a cycle. The thyroid gland, adrenal gland, and then gender differences are all that's happening and being used, and some of this stuff helps define some of those differences. Now, you will know people that have certain growth hormone issues potentially, or they just might have different problems related to their glands, and these hormones really do affect a lot of things in people. For further information, there's this chart here that talks about each hormone that goes out here. And so, there's different problems that people may develop that cause there to be not enough testosterone, not enough estrogen, too much of one or the other, and being in that opposite gender group. And so these are things that a doctor definitely needs to look at and address. So first menstruation occurs 2 years after the beginning of other visible signs of puberty, usually the first signals of first primary sex characteristics. Pregnancy can occur after the first period, as we all know. And today's day and age, periods are starting much earlier for girls, some as young as 8 years old. And that's pretty young. And that's just a lot of things that you have to talk about with a child in order to help prepare them for puberty. In first primary sex characteristics, you'll have growth of the testes and the penis, growth of ovaries, uterus, and vagina. Usually that's part of the second characteristics. You'll start seeing breast development, the voice changing, hair, facial hair and body hair will start coming. And usually after those things come, then you'll start to see signs of potentially a period coming, or a woman may receive, or a girl may receive her first period. The timing is of a period or puberty is getting younger and younger. And they say this has to do with diet and lifestyle changes. You know, I've heard a bunch of people talk about hormones in milk and things of these nature and in our food that's affecting people, and there may be some truth to that. Everyone has a different thought process, but they do say due to some of the way we're living our lives, that's what's causing these things to start earlier. So sexual development in boys, sperm production begins to produce between the ages 12 to 14, and the first ejaculation is between ages 13 to 14. Genital development and pubic hair development precede the end of the growth spurt, and development of a beard and voice changes occur near the end of the sequence. And we all can remember those junior awkward high years where, you know, you have some boys, their voices are changing or they're growing. You know, some girls are growing or they stop growing. My best friend, she was 5 feet and 3/4 in 6th grade, and she's still that height, but in 6th grade she was the tallest girl in our class, just because she developed much earlier than the rest of us. And girls' heredity and behavioral factors influence hormonal secretions. The major body changes occur before age 11 or 12. Girls have consistently more negative views of their own bodies, and this is influenced by our society, and we know this, right? Boys are more sexually active than girls, and reports of sexual intercourse vary across ethnic groups, right? The rate of teen sexual behavior has declined substantially over the last 3 decades. But I think maybe actual intercourse has declined, but I think there's other things that teens are doing that are not maybe necessarily sex, but there's oral sex, anal sex, a lot of things that aren't necessarily considered intercourse, but are very intimate things that young people are doing. Here this shows sexual activity among high school students. The males that have had at least sex once, and females that have had sex at least once. Most of these males are having sex earlier, but then it seems like the females catch up by 12th grade, which is interesting. It says here 51% of 12th grade girls are sexually active and 44% of 12th grade boys. And, you know, this is a very interesting discussion if you were to think about it. I just wonder if that 24% of boys that is interested in having sex in 9th grade eventually get to these girls, and then their sexual activity change. And I think overall the aggressiveness of females when it comes nowadays to sex, I think they're way more interested and way more assertive with it than maybe before. Characteristics of girls who are sexually active: they may have an early period, low interest in school and school activities, early dating, and history of sexual abuse potentially. Activities and moral beliefs influence lower sexual activity among teens who believe premarital sex is wrong, attend religious services, participate in school activities, and do not use alcohol. So again, in teens that believe in abstinence, waiting till marriage, obviously there's going to be less sexual activity, but that does not mean that they're not doing sexual things. And I think that sometimes gets confused because we focus on the actual act of intercourse versus holiness, which God calls us to obtain to. So it can get kind of confusing. God does not hate sex. He designed sex. However, I think sometimes our culture gets things, or the church culture gets things mixed up and make it sound so terrible when it's not terrible. It's just the timing is not appropriate. Among sexually active students, 90% report contraceptive use, which nowadays we talk about condoms, birth control, things of that nature very often. Teens show ignorance of STDs, which I think a lot of young people think that's not going to happen to me until it does. And it happens. I think in certain areas, as of recently, they talk about HIV being a major issue because there's so many multiple partners and people are not using protection. Abstinence and contraceptive education are so controversial in many schools. And I think in most schools, you have to have a parent's permission in order to do those things. Higher in the U.S. than many other industrialized countries is adolescent pregnancy, far more frequent among older adolescents, and the relative frequency of teens who are unmarried has increased, but teen birth rates have dropped overall, which some of that may be due to proper education and talking about sex more readily with parents, with other adults, just knowing that there are other methods for birth control. And then let's see here. I want to talk about anything else left in this chapter. Factors in teen pregnancy: the onset age of sexual activity, so how early you're having sex, family influences, less school success, and less contraception use are obviously clear factors of teen pregnancy. And we're kind of going to get into this a little bit in our next chapter. So the negative outcomes: achieve developmental milestones more slowly when infants of teen moms, and they grow up in poverty, which is a potential depending on family support. And positive possibilities: negative effects can be mitigated by support from girls' own parents, and staying in school and social programs positively help child and mother. And there are a lot of great programs out there to help people if they're going through this situation, which is great and helps moms finish school and get things done, which is fantastic. Okay, our next chapter, we're going to be talking about some of the social portions of this. So again, there's the genital stage when we're looking through Freud's lenses here. And it's the primary developmental task: libido channeled into healthy sexual relationship and psychosexual maturity achieved in genital stage. Identity versus role confusion. The primary developmental task achievement of a personal identity reflects understanding of one's own unique traits and how they manifest across ages and social roles. So how you identify yourself is usually with your friend group or the inability to have an integrated view of self. So sense of self becomes integrated. You're trying to figure out, who am I as an individual and who am I based on who my friends are, which is a big moment, right? Identity formation has two key parts: a crisis and commitment. So the crisis of, oh my gosh, who am I and who am I going to be committed to being? The components of self-understanding: more abstract definition of psychological self, academic self-comment concepts from internal comparisons and external comparisons, and social self-concepts predict behavior. So again, influences are huge in this season of life for young people and really determining who they define themselves to be. And you know, we always see cliques and different groups of peers, and then that's like who they identify themselves with, but kids also need to know who they are outside of their peers and friends, just in case that changes or those people aren't good for them and things of that nature. Gender differences look different. So girls are influenced by internal and external comparisons. So it means what they think of themselves inside their brain and then how they compare themselves to their peers. And then boys are more influenced by internal and self-defined, who they see themselves as, and then what's going on in their own little minds. And we can see these in people that we know or our own children, things of that nature. Now, self-esteem, again, I don't like this word, but I'm going to use this word right now. Self-esteem patterns. High self-esteem is there's correlations to probably how you're raised, who your support network is, who you have believing in you, and gender differences throughout our adolescence. I mean, again, probably, you know, depending on how you see yourself, that's going to affect how you feel about yourself, right? How your friends see you, how other people see you. It's going to affect how you view yourself. Gender-related aspects of the psychological self. Adolescents continue to understand sex roles as social conventions, and gender role is identity growth and more flexible. So, ethnic identity. So how we see ourselves in the midst of our ethnicity. Self-identification as a member of a specific group and as a unique individual. So, some people won't say they have an ethnic identity. Other people will, and this can cause a lot of potential confusion. There was a survey done with 4,500 African American boys and asked them to name a role model. A large majority named a professional athlete. Not one child listed a teacher, which is really sad. The highlights ways in which the media portrays various careers and the influences these peers portrays may have on children's career aspirations. So if I identify with maybe a professional athlete, then that's what I want to be, even though there's maybe a lot of other potential great role models that are outside of that. And that's not necessarily a fantastic thing, right? There can be major clashes between parents and cultural values, and this can be a lot due to, they may be, say, if they're first generation, parents might be really stuck to old cultural ways, which might be against the child who's trying to become Americanized, and there can create a lot of conflict and confusion. Or they show themselves to be a certain way at home, and then they're different at school. This happens a lot with teenagers. You see it all the time. So pre-conventional reasoning, judgments based on the positive or negative consequences to the child. Protocol responses to moral dilemmas, 3 levels with 2 substages each. So here's the 3 levels. So there's a pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Going back to the moral reasoning, I think as a parent, it's most important that your kids not only respect God, of course, from a Christian perspective, but that they respect you. And how they judge, how they make choices, they should be caring more about what mom and dad think than what their friends think. Because if they start caring more about what their friends think, there's a potential of losing your child and then making decisions that aren't necessarily great based upon, I want my friends to like me more than I care if my mom and dad are going to be upset at me. So just some things to think about. There's more here to look at, but this is just a brief overview of both of these chapters. Very interesting stuff. Adolescence is a rough time. A lot's going on, and we can see why we potentially have so much conflict during this time as parents with our children. Have a great week. We're almost there. Hang in there. 3 more weeks to go.